Thank you, comrades. So yes, I'm kicking off this session by looking at the south of Ireland and its relationship to the border and the issues that it has raised and the recent developments. And Kevin is going to look at the north of Ireland. Obviously, there's going to be overlaps, but we thought that this was a sensible division. So this year marks the centenary of partition. And it's very interesting that the national question and the border in Ireland is once again on the agenda, but I would say in a very different context to that which existed in 1921. In 1921, the partition of Ireland, as most comrades obviously will know, was a solution brought about by the British government in order to resolve the Irish question, to stop the Irish problem continuing to create difficulties for them in Westminster, and to stop it, basically the troublesome Irish who continued to rebel against its rule. You will know that we had 1916 rising, and following that, a massive election victory for Sinn Féin, over 80% of the population voting for them, and then the War of Independence. So basically the British government came up with this solution for itself and set up a border commission to draw a border around those counties which had a Protestant majority. So Northern Ireland, again, as people will know, is not a province. It's 6 counties of a province, which all other Irish provinces have 9 counties. So, okay, so basically it was a way of buying off the representatives of the Irish national movement at the time. People like Michael Collins and others signed up to this as a way they thought to make progress towards Irish unity. They didn't see it as an end in and of itself, and always believed, I think, well, though obviously Michael Collins didn't live long, hadn't signed the treaty, but Arthur Griffith continued to believe that it was something that would be revisited soon after the border was created, that it was just to kind of pacify the Unionists in the north. Anyway, the southern establishment, the new state that was set up in the south, which was first a free state, and then after the Second World War, I think is when it became the Republic, perhaps actually 1939. Anyway, so a civil war followed the partition. And it's where then that, I suppose, the defining period of Irish establishment politics comes into play. And you see the creation of Sinn Féin and then Fianna Fáil and then Fine Gael, who are now Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are the 2 mainstream establishment parties in the South. I should say, perhaps Kevin will mention it, that the establishment of the partition was something which was in the middle of major attacks on Catholics in the north of Ireland, and also in the south. The Civil War saw the deaths of many, and I suppose really the alienation of many sections of the Irish Republican movement from each other. And like stories would go back even today to who would you have supported during the Civil War. Anyway, the Irish state that was established under the leadership of Eamon de Valera is one that's infamous for its reactionary nature. James Connolly's very, very famous quote about the Carnival of Reaction was certainly reflected in the nature of the Irish state post-1921. Under De Valera and his arch allies, McQuaid, Archbishop McQuaid, they created a constitution which was to reflect an Irish government for an Irish state for a Catholic state for Catholic people. So the church ruled. The church ran everything. I mean, they were funded to run health and education and all aspects of social provision. And they ruled in an extremely authoritarian way. It was a very bad time to be a woman in Ireland from, the 1920s to the 1990s, actually. Women were really repressed, had to give up their jobs, hadn't get married, stay in the home, were forced to have child after child. I mean, you weren't even able to get condoms except illegally until, was it perhaps the 1990s? I'm not even actually sure. It might have been 1980s. So, women like my mother, an educated, able, professional, had to give up her job when she got married and try and cope somehow with avoiding having as many children as possible, and like living a life which was just a shadow of a life. As well, migration was the answer for Irish people as they left in their, hundreds and thousands abroad. So, as well, I just wanted to mention the development of the Civil War in the North, only just from the perspective of the South. When the Irish Civil War in the North broke out in the 1970s, is interesting because although the southern state had a constitutional claim to the North, which wasn't removed from the constitution until after the Good Friday Agreement, basically the North was a real problem for the Irish establishment. And it basically made it very dangerous even to say that you supported the armed struggle. And, people like there were major martial powers, like we weren't allowed to listen to the voice of Gerry Adams. They had an actor do a voiceover, as though the voice of Gerry Adams, when you do finally hear it, would make you kind of melt into republicanism. It's just absolutely absurd. But it was like an atmosphere of intimidation. I mean, I remember being interested in politics and what was going on in the North, and I had some friends that supported the hunger strikers, but it was really difficult to speak about it. It was a shame, and it's something that you just do not want to talk about because you do not want those troubles to come down south. And obviously they did over the years, and with different IRA forces in the south. But it was something that I suppose I even think in some ways that the Irish government was even more vehemently against the armed struggle than the British government. Okay. So basically, having kind of ran through that first 70 years or 60 years or so, I just want to focus now briefly on the changes that have come about since that period. There was a change, I think a very distinct change came about in the 1990s. We had, in terms of economics, we had the relocation of many United States firms to Ireland, where there was an educated workforce, and basically people were able to find work. Unemployment was not such a problem as it had been before. Then we had the development of the building industry, which is notorious because of its role in the Celtic Tiger, which came about in that period. So basically we had an economy develop in the 1990s under a coalition government of Fianna Fáil and the Labour Party, although there were different coalition partners, but basically Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach at the time, was the one who signified the Celtic Tiger. And this major kind of bubble, I won't go into the details of what it represented, except to say that when it collapsed in 2008, a lot of people found themselves in very serious problems and very serious debt because of the level of borrowing that they had been individually and otherwise, and obviously the working class paid for that. But during that time, some, other things happened that I think were positive. Firstly, you had people coming back to Ireland for the first time. Secondly, you had more people being able to stay, being able to make a choice to stay. And thirdly, you had inward migration for the first time, I would say, possibly ever, to any extent. You had people from Eastern Europe, in particular Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe coming to Ireland looking for work. And obviously, work was mainly in the construction industry in that period. So we had a kind of a change in Irish life, and how Irish people saw themselves. And that was then very much linked to the demise of the hold of the Catholic Church in that period. So, because of the work of some extremely dedicated and fearless journalists, we saw the exposure of the Catholic Church and its abuse. And it came down, brick by brick. And at every stage defended itself fiercely, but unsuccessfully. We saw exposed how the industrial schools had worked during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, how children had been abused, how unmarried mothers had been abused, had been put in the Magdalen laundries, the infamous Magdalen laundries. The whole of society that had existed in that period was shown to have been an extremely cruel and unjust system of domination by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was shown to have, in truth, despised the ordinary people, despised the working class. So with that demise and a kind of a new cosmopolitan atmosphere in the country, came the development of secularism. So we had changes, 1995, the first divorce referendum and divorce law, which allowed divorce under extremely, really very difficult circumstances, but lots of people got divorced who had, been separated for many years. Then we had, after that, we had a number of other referendums, and the most recent ones being the referendum allowing marriage equality, which I think was in 2017, and then the referendum on abortion rights, which was in 2018. And on both of those occasions, there were overwhelming votes to allow same-sex marriage and abortion rights. And what also was interesting about them is that in those referendums, young people who had been working abroad came home and voted. They decided, rather than previous waves of migrants who went away and tried to stay away and kind of continue to have this sentimental idea of the old country, they wanted to take action. They felt that they had a vested interest in making sure that Ireland took steps forward to become more modern, more secular, more egalitarian. In fact, Kieran Allen describes in his book, Kieran Allen, who is People for Profit Alliance, socialist worker movement in Ireland, has written a book on the 32 counties, the failure of partition and the case for United Ireland, where he talks about how following the referendum on abortion, that activists went north. This was kind of I suppose, a reenactment in the opposite direction of things that had happened in the 1970s and 80s when people had brought condoms from the north down to Ireland and blown them up in Connolly Station on their arrival back from Belfast, like breaking the law. And obviously in the north, Kevin can talk about this, but the situation was, following the Irish referendum on abortion, that the situation in the north, women still had very few rights, and obviously that has changed now because of action on the part of the British government. Okay, so Ireland today, certainly no Shangri-La. There's lots of economic problems, lots of economic precarity, but in terms of secularism, it is a very, very different country from that country that I left in 1987 to that which I returned to in 2006, and has increasingly become more since. So we have we did have a Taoiseach now. So Taoiseach being the Prime Minister, he's now Taoiseach being the Deputy Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, who is an openly gay man of mixed race who has led the campaign for abortion rights and was involved in the equal marriage one. I just want to insert a caveat here and say I do not think that those demands for change came from above. I do not think he spearheaded them. And you can even see from the Dáil record that he was very conservative on these questions before it became convenient to jump on board. Neither, however, do I think that, despite the fact that the Constitution remains very misogynist in many respects, that those things wouldn't be changed by the Irish state. I think, it can do what it needs to do in order to ensure it stays in power. So, okay, so therefore then we have the collapse of the Soviet Union also in the 1990s, the change in policy of the IRA, decision to enter into talks, and the Good Friday Agreement comes into being. Now, the Good Friday Agreement has meant important changes for the South. Firstly, we see the development of Sinn Féin as a serious political entity, obviously in government in the North, but in the South, it has grown in prestige and influence enormously in the last, 20 years or so. And particularly recently, it has managed to achieve very high electoral results. So in the 2020 general election, which I've written about in the Weekly Worker, Sinn Féin stood only 42 candidates, and we have a PR system here in the Republic. That was against, I think it was 84 or so stood by Fianna Fáil and 82 by Fine Gael. It ended up with 37 seats. That makes it the second largest party, only one behind Fine Gael, and it beat Fianna Fáil, which is the constitutional Republican Party, always seen as that. The Good Friday Agreement also meant the establishment of many cross-border entities on trade, on tourism, on the environment, etc. And you could see that reflected even in terms of what you could buy in your local shop. Lots of things were coming from the North. So if the Good Friday Agreement, the referendum, was 94% in favour in the South. Now, there was a relatively small turnout, between 50 and 60%. Anyway, so basically I would say that from that period up to 2016, we had the continued development of links across the border. Then Brexit happened, and Brexit has, as Gerry Adams has put it, changed everything. So because the majority of the population in the north of Ireland voted Remain, it has really made a major difference to unionism, which Kevin will talk about, but also to the prospect of a united Ireland in Europe, which has obviously been something which is at the heart of Sinn Féin's programme, but also increasingly so for the other mainstream parties. Sinn Féin has run a very effective pro-border poll campaign since 2016. And as people will know, or I should just mention at this stage, under the Good Friday Agreement, there would be a referendum if it became the time that it was seen as necessary. In the north, it's different to the south. there would be, in the south, there would be a referendum. Now, this referendum would have to be focused on changing the constitution, because the Good Friday referendum in 1998 changed Article 2 and 3 of the constitution to remove the claim made on the North and to say instead that we aspire to be a united Ireland, but that we acknowledge the need for there to be majority consent both sides of the border. So and like so much of this, as in the Good Friday Agreement, as the Good Friday Agreement acknowledges, is based on demographics. So just to also say at this stage is that recent polls conducted in the South have shown that the majority, between 60 and 70%, want Irish unity. So the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was just, we were talking about for years, it seemed, and has caused so much rancor with the Unionists in the North and caused so much trouble within their own ranks, has been actually quite an interesting phenomenon in terms of what has happened in the South, in relation to the relationship between the North and the South. So I've just been looking at recent media reports, and the Irish Office of Statistics, Central Statistics Office, reported in August this year, I've just read about this yesterday in the Irish Times, that the imports from the Republic of Ireland to the Republic of Ireland from Northern Ireland have risen by 77% since Britain left the EU in January of this year, and which is a remarkable surge. So also what has happened, and I've read about this a little bit, maybe other people will know more, well, perhaps Kevin will, was that we've had the development of new ports and routes to Europe. So it was believed, and I certainly also believed it, and it may still come to pass, that the Irish Republic would be hit really badly by Brexit. But they seem to be getting around this. Firstly, obviously, there's free trade between North and South. Secondly, rather than relying on the route to Europe through Britain, they're establishing new routes through Rosslare, Cork, Dublin, directly to Europe. So it seems that, like, the Irish economy as an all-Ireland economy is growing far closer than it's ever been. And even that, in fact, that the Brexit has brought Irish unity more to the fore and made it far more of a concrete possibility. Obviously, Sinn Féin is really building on all of this, and it's produced a number of policy documents that can be seen on its website, showing the many benefits of a united Ireland economically, politically, etc., etc., etc. I think it's very like the SNP, actually, in much of its political propaganda. So I know I haven't got much time left. I just want to make two other main points. Firstly, I want to look very briefly at what two left-wing individuals are saying about the Northern Ireland and the border poll, and then just finally to put some questions back to you as the audience. Kieran Allen, who I've mentioned before, who's the leader of the Socialist Workers Movement here in Ireland, wrote a book that I also mentioned before. Now, he is for a border poll. He and his comrades, which include three TDs, three TDs, have gone out and campaigned and had various kind of photo opportunities by the border, calling for a border poll. He argues, a little bit like Tommy Sheridan and Alan McCombs argued, that that a border poll would bring about a united Ireland, which would be a first step on the road to what Connolly wanted. That it would be a progressive entity because of the changes in the South, because, you know, all of the things that I've spoken about earlier have happened, that the South has changed a great deal, and that a border poll, somebody's asking what's the border poll? Okay, the border poll is the poll that was basically, it's not included, I don't think it's named as such in the Good Friday Agreement, but it is a referendum that will take place in the north and in the south of Ireland to decide whether the border should be removed and that there should be a united Ireland. That's essentially what a border poll is. So they have been campaigning for a border poll. And I went to a day school where they talked about this, and they had a document circulating, a commitment to a border poll for everybody to sign up to it. But if you didn't sign up to it, they didn't contact you afterwards because you couldn't be involved in the campaign because you couldn't have a difference on that question. This is despite many criticisms of the Good Friday Agreement by members of the audience. So he argues that what we need is social movements, north and south, and these would be around secular ideas, women's rights, blah, 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 health, environment, etc., etc., etc. All of these things will bring about a radical united Ireland. He also says Sinn Féin are in power in the north, they're the agents of capitalism in the north, but in the south, where they could go into government and coalition, then we may support them if it suits us. So in other words, they're going to support Sinn Féin because that's the driving force in this whole thing. On the IRA, he says that it was a problem, it became a problem because, you know, it ran out of steam and it became ghettoized, but he makes no, he gives no recognition to the democracy of that armed struggle. It seems to me he wants bourgeois constitutional solutions, and he sees them as a stepping stone to whatever he believes socialism to be, which sounds to me, again, very like the SSP idea of an island of fabulous socialism and egalitarianism in the Atlantic. We saw what happened with that. Then Paul Murphy, who was a member of the Irish Socialist Party and then split, and now has an organisation called RISE, which has joined the People for Profit Alliance. He wrote an article in their journal Rupture, and his is much more nuanced. His approach is much more nuanced. He definitely is against the IRA, but that would be their legacy. You know, I can talk about that later if people want to. He says a border poll is unavoidable. You just can't avoid it. It's going to happen. You can't abstain for it. So therefore, I think he's saying no to any boycott. We need to build a socialist voice in it. We must be aware of the problems which could result, and he then talks about the problems that could happen with the North, with Protestants in the North being alienated by it, about the possibility of reaction within it. And he also says we need to be separate from Sinn Féin. So he's got a better attitude, but nevertheless, he says also we need to call for a border poll. Sinn Féin, as I said, are leading the struggle, but interestingly, Fine Gael, like totally out of character to its historic practice, has now, its leader, Varadkar, has said that he can see the United Ireland in the not too distant future, and that he wants to set up a branch of Fine Gael in the north. And this is like obviously them trying to outflank Sinn Féin. Okay, so I'm going to finish. I've mentioned the various events that have led us up to this stage. I've mentioned the changes in environments. I haven't dwelt very much on referenda per se. However, I would say this. Look, when it came to the referendum on abortion rights, although what was on the ballot paper was a lot short of what we wanted, I think it was important to vote yes. I think a boycott in those circumstances would have been absurd. I also think that with marriage equality. So I think that I don't agree with the position that referendum per se are a bad thing. I think it depends on the circumstances. I know what the problems of it are, but at the same time, I think it can be beneficial. If we had actually boycotted those referendums, I think it would have been wrong. However, in a situation where you're having the possibility of a border poll under the Good Friday Agreement, I think that is a different thing. I don't think simply voting yes or campaigning for a border poll would be the right idea. In fact, I think campaigning for a border poll is feeding into the illusion that the Good Friday Agreement and the British government had a positive role and continue to have a positive role to play. I look back in my research to articles in the Weekly Worker and found one thanks to the comrades who've been uploading the old papers onto the web, written by a certain Jack Conrad in 1998 on the Good Friday Agreement referendum. And in that article, he calls for a boycott. But what he says we need to call for instead, and I quote, just give me 2 seconds. Okay. Communists should therefore call for, if there was nothing genuinely democratic about the May the 22nd referendum, which was on the Good Friday Agreement. If it was, there would be an all-Ireland referendum around the fundamental question of the border. Communists therefore call for a boycott. We are for a democratically elected all-Ireland constitutional assembly whereby the Irish people can freely decide their own future without Blair or Clinton setting the agenda. So I think that's actually a good idea. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Anne. And I hope comrades won't think of this as a partitionist approach to divide the talk into 2 sections. But we thought that it would be important for comrades to understand the type of political pressures that are building up for a border poll in the 26 counties. I'm going to look at the situation in the 6 counties, and I want to, in particular, stress the immediate impact of Brexit, which has thrown up a number of questions, which in many ways the Good Friday Agreement had not laid to rest, far from it, but had rather managed and indeed had somewhat softened. Anne, in her opening, referred to the nature of the quote, all-Ireland economy. And those sorts of developments, along with the management of a particular type of communalized politics in the 6 counties between the forces of unionism and constitutional nationalism as represented by Sinn Féin, had in a sense managed the underlying conflict about the future of Ireland, the national democracy in Ireland, the status of the 6 counties. And it was very much in the rhetoric that, that from this situation, not only would we get a type of stability, but also that it could evolve in particular ways. This was certainly the language that was developed at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And it was a lot of the rationale. For example, Sinn Féin were arguing in the 2000s that there would almost be a seamless transition and that the border would, in a sense, wither away. Now, of course, what the Brexit question did was to throw open the economic and the political status of the 6 counties. And as comrades are aware, through the so-called Northern Irish Protocol and the status of the 6 counties as being part of the European single market and subject to certain customs and other EU regulations, then that, in a sense, separated the 6 counties from Great Britain. And indeed, it sort of posed very clearly the status of the 6 counties. Now, in the last few months, or particularly in the last year, there have been really a series of political crises that have come from that. Comrades will be aware that the Democratic Unionist Party, the largest unionist party, has gone through 3 leaders. At the beginning of this year, we had Arlene Foster. That was she resigned, to be followed by, I think, the 50-day reign of Edwin Poots. And then he was replaced by Geoffrey Donaldson. And this, in a way, reflects really the sort of unease within the unionist political population about the impact of Brexit, and indeed about their future constitutional status. So if for no other reason alone, Brexit has seriously destabilized unionism, but has posed these other questions. Now, I'd like to perhaps talk a little bit about the different sort of forces and classes in the 6 counties, and particularly to talk about the role of different parties, the role of different states. And that's because the point that Anne made was about change, and she went to great lengths, quite correctly, to talk about the changing nature of the 26 counties, and in particular to sort of frame the national question in that way. So the Irish state of the late 1960s, when the war broke out in the north, is in some ways a very different society. But I would argue that the political line of the Dublin government and of the southern ruling class is still essentially the same, which is to manage the conflict in Ireland, to stabilise their own state, and indeed to act in the interests of the Irish capitalist class and its bigger interests in relation, increasingly in the 70s onwards, with the multinationals, and of course its relationship towards the European Union. So its policy is very much one of stability, and it saw the Good Friday Agreement, in which it worked in very close partnership with the British state, with the government, well, the first government to be essentially involved was Thatcher's government in the late 80s, then Major and then Blair. It essentially was working in partnership with Britain. So I suppose the perspective of the southern ruling class was that reunification was not only not on the immediate agenda, but it was one that they would distinctly not welcome. Indeed, throughout the war in the north, the southern state had played a very active role in suppressing that. It had done so through counterinsurgency methods, extraditions, internments, and so on. But it had also functioned politically to do that from the time of the Sunningdale Agreement, the first, quote, power sharing agreement in the 1970s, through the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and indeed during the so-called peace process itself. So I don't think we should be under any illusions about the attitude of the Dublin ruling class. But I think we do also need to look at the nature of British interest, and also the interests of other parties and social groupings inside the north itself. The position of the British government, I think, is the one that is the most interesting. Obviously, its war against the IRA, its war to maintain British rule in Ireland, had many different interests and many different facets to it. I would argue that certainly by the 1960s, that Britain's economic and sort of direct imperialist interests in Ireland were very different from the situation in the 1920s. And that was because of the particularly the economic changes in the north. The north had deindustrialized or was deindustrializing. And increasingly, in fact, really for the whole of the time of the existence of the 6 counties, it had been a drain on British resources. So far from being an asset, it was actually something of a liability in economic terms. Now, that means that although Greater Belfast in particular was what had been a very important part of the sort of economic powerhouse of British imperialism, increasingly that ceased to be. Industries went into decline, engineering, shipbuilding, textiles, and so forth. But I think there was still a strategic interest, and that was particularly an issue in the Second World War, and I wouldn't rule out the importance of the control of the northern approaches to Great Britain, even today. In fact, I might even argue that the heightened possibilities of naval warfare make that an issue. But I think there's also a wider political interest, and that to me was both the connections between the British ruling class, the Tories in particular, and the Unionists in the north. But also, I think the big argument was that a defeat for British imperialism, and particularly Britain being forced to withdraw from Ireland, would have been a serious political and psychological blow. I managed to catch some of the debate today about Afghanistan, and if you can imagine British troops having to get out of Ireland in the face of an IRA campaign, and you can imagine the ramifications of that in terms of British society at any point in the 60s and 70s, particularly the early 70s. Comrades are old enough to remember will know the nature of that campaign, and indeed I think the serious political challenge. The IRA was militarily contained, I think, as early as 1972, 1973. But the political challenge, which increased with the election of Sinn Féin following the hunger strikes in '81, these all pose quite serious political challenges to the British state and particularly to its prestige. Again, in the 70s, the British state was facing internal opposition, not only from the working class movement, but also increasingly from ethnic minorities in the cities. Again, comrades who are old enough to remember will remember the idea that that the struggle in Britain was intimately linked to the struggle in Ireland and vice versa. So I think that there's very clearly a political interest as well as a strategic interest. I think the economic interest indeed is now really quite minimal in that way. So British interests then are for, I think, stability and for management of the status quo, to maintain that status quo, and above all to maintain the reconfiguration of the status quo that was seen in the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, again, I'm sure that comrades are very well aware of its of how it was formulated, was a form of structured power sharing. It had a forcible coalition structure. It meant essentially that parties representing the two main political tendencies and trends, broadly those who favour the maintenance of the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and those who favour some form of reunification. And that model was meant to allow the unionist majority to remain comfortably in control, to allow a certain amount of nationalist input, but essentially the status quo would remain. Now that status quo was also built on a number of other changes, and what's interesting in terms of what Anna's said about the 26 counties is that many of those changes were in a sense going along in parallel lines. The North in the 1980s, I think, began to undergo quite an important social and economic change. And the social change is both, in a sense, a fallout of deindustrialization, but also it's part of a conscious strategy by the British state to incorporate sections of the nationalist. I will use the term Catholic, partly because when we talk about demography, but it's essentially an idea of incorporating sections of the nationalist population into British rule. So if you look at the British state under direct rule, many of the legal and the formal abuses that were part of the Protestant state for a Protestant people were removed. It meant, for example, that fair employment legislation outlawed many of them, alongside quite a conscious strategy of employing Catholics in the public sector. On top of this, state funding into particular areas, support for NGOs and intermediate bodies between the population and the state, all were very important, I think, in creating not only a new Catholic middle class, but actually encouraging the idea that the British state could be an instrument for removing many of the disabilities that nationals faced. On the other side of the coin, in terms of economic and social development, is, of course, the continuing decline of the economic and social power that underpin unionism. So many of the industries in which the social power of unionism is based went into long-term decline. The one that's always cited, of course, is Harland and Wolff, which at its height employed 20,000 people. Now, for example, employs somewhere between 100 and 500 people, and is a specialist oil rig maintenance. It's, I think, Norwegian or German owned. But if you look across Belfast, you have essentially a post-industrial economy. Why that's significant is that the carnival of reaction rested, I think, particularly in the urban areas, on that privilege and on that power of unionism, particularly that cross-class alliance within unionism between the unionist elites, the industrialists, and above all, the locally owned businesses. The unionist ruling class in the 6 counties were often owners of particular businesses. Again, comrades are familiar with the north of Ireland. If you go to any sort of provincial town, places like Dungannon and Enniskillen, and you go down the main street, you would have seen family-run businesses, and these family-run businesses, along with their associated accountants and solicitors, all would have been the local elites. Many of them would have been, bigwigs in the local unionist party. Although, of course, nationalists would also have had their elites who would be, mediators as well between their population and the state in that way. Now, of course, that really went into decline. And that social and economic power, I think, is also reflected politically. The ability of unionism to impose its political will in the 6 counties, and particularly to confront any amelioration that the British state wanted to introduce, was severely weakened. Sunningdale in '74 and the Ulster Workers' Council strike was probably the last occasion when the unions could really impose that type of veto. After 1974, they could mount protests, but they were no longer in a position to overthrow a system. So they had a type of veto, that they could prevent a system being introduced, but what they couldn't do was impose their preferred form of a return of Stormont. So the Good Friday Agreement, although primarily designed to bring in militant republicanism and more importantly to bring in sections of the Catholic population to manage this stately, also had the effect of drawing in sections of unionism. I won't again go into the details, but I can in the discussion about the way that happened. Now, one of the results of the Good Friday Agreement was to accelerate many of the processes that I've described. And these have their political reflections. The basic political structure of the North from the time of partition was a type of sectarian headcount. That meant in the famous phrase that every election was a referendum on the Constitution. And of course, given the fact that at the time of partition, the electorates in the 6 counties would constitute somewhere just in the upper 60s, maybe 70% unionist and about 30% nationalist, that would look, that made it a fairly secure state. Indeed, as Anne has said, the border, which was finally confirmed in 1925, was drawn up especially for that purpose, to give a secure area in which unionists would have a majority. It would also include within it substantial Catholic minorities in two counties, Fermanagh and Tyrone, clear Catholic majorities, a rather 50-50 situation in Armagh, and, you know, again, some imbalances in Derry. The only really clear areas at that stage that unionism could say they held as their own would be East Derry, then down to Antrim and particularly North Down, then into Armagh and of course Belfast. Now, what of course happened in the succeeding years, and indeed is now becoming very apparent, is of course a demographic shift. And one of the points behind the current destabilization of unionism is that demographic shift. And that demographic shift has been seen in the rise of nationalist political parties. In particular, the rise of Sinn Féin, which up until about 2001, 2003, was still behind the openly constitutional nationalist SDLP. But increasingly, that has now become the voice of the nationalist population. And indeed, it reflects the way that politics in the 6 counties are a form of sort of communalized competition, and that in particular parties like Sinn Féin and the DUP represent their population, their community, and they do so in a form of communal bargaining, communal mobilization, and in particular of attempting to extract benefits for their population. So that much of the debate, when you look at it in Stormont or you look at it in the local councils, is about what we've got. You know, them's the opposition, the other side gets something, we must have it. And it means that politics become very much a bargaining for resources. They also become a process by which Sinn Féin mediates between their population and the British state. So they now have that type of role. Any idea that they represent any form of sort of militant republicanism, I think were really being seriously tarnished by the early 90s. But when they went into the Good Friday Agreement and accepted their position as part of the British state, then that obviously really came to an end. But on the unionist side, the growth of the DUP also, I think, reflects what we might call a very communalist form of politics, a defense of the unionists, the Protestant population against Catholics, against nationalists. And again, the way that the DUP operated was to outflank the UUP to their right. Now, this was very much a recipe for stasis, and there was a type of equilibrium. That equilibrium was sometimes upset by particular crises, but essentially there was a form of equilibrium. What destabilized the current pattern of equilibrium was, of course, Brexit, which again, comrades of Anne has already referred to. And that starts to pose then the future of the 6 counties. A couple of other factors also throw this up too, and that's of course not only the demographic rise of the nationalist population, but a very close electoral position. In recent elections, Sinn Féin have come very close to overtaking the DUP. And indeed, if we start to look in places like Derry, which has always been a nationalist majority anyway, but Belfast as well, these are clearly now nationalist cities. And indeed, if we look at the electoral map of the north of Ireland, we see that across wide areas, in MPs, a good example, that Unionists now only have secure majorities in parts of Down and Antrim, East Derry, and parts of the Lagan Valley down into North Armagh. In other words, the Unionist population are in a sense of retreat, and indeed the politics, very sort of pessimistic politics of retreat, and the sense that their former position not only will not be regained, but indeed the possibilities of reunification and of this border poll that Anne has referred to, will rise. And I'm not sure when the census results will be out, but it's widely predicted that the sections of the population identifying as Catholic will either come very close to those defined as Protestant, or indeed overtake them in this year's census. Now, we've talked, I suppose, in quite broad terms, and Anna's made quite a clear case about the border poll and why we should be opposed to it. Indeed, why the sort of demands that we should put should stay really very clearly away from it. I was thinking in preparing for this evening about the sort of points that Moshe made this morning in relation to the Middle East, and about how we might look at the underlying sort of material bases. And what I've tried to do here in very broad terms is talk about those. And I think that we need not only to sort of use broad terms like unionist and nationalist, but we also need to look at class interest and also state interest as well. And I've tried to argue that the attitude of the Irish and the British states are for forms of stabilisation. And I've also tried to talk about their state interest. I think the Irish state is in quite an interesting position, in that I think its state interest, and Brexit may well accelerate that, has been more towards an orientation towards continental Europe. And indeed, I think that's a reflection of the weakness of British imperialism. And although it obviously can't ignore London, and it is still quite intimately tied with the British economy and British politics, the very fact that Dublin took an independent line and actually oriented with the rest of the European Union, I think has a certain significance in that way. What Brexit has done, though, I think is in many ways to throw up the reality of the situation in the north, and in particular to pose the question for sections of both the unionist and the nationalist population about their future. Now, we are still in, I think, a very unclear period, and why I wanted to sort of try to be clear about the material interest is that for many sections of the nationalist population, particularly that group that I broadly refer to as the nationalist middle class, the status quo is or was delivering for them. Many of them were employed in the public sector. The Northern Irish state is still quite a large employer. The state is still one of the most important factors in the economy. And again, anybody that's familiar with the North will be aware, you only have to open the pages of newspapers to see the way that nationalists are now really integrated into the status quo. As long ago as 30 years, Eamon McCann made the point that all of the leading legal and public prosecution figures in Derry were Catholics. And if, like me, you're an avid reader of the accountancy and business pages of the Belfast Telegraph, you will see no end of people, not only with Catholic names, but actually their names as Gaeilge, in other words, in Irish. And I think that is a sort of reflection of this new middle class that sort of found its place in the sun. But of course, there's another section of the nationalist population who haven't got so much of a place in the sun. And those will be the people who were in many ways the bedrock of the Republican movement, the urban working class, sections of the rural poor, small farmers, and so on. Many of them still face all of the social and economic problems that we've seen before. But the perhaps more interesting developments are within unionism. And again, I think the recent debate about the protocol and about the way that unionists reacted to that does throw up something of a crisis. And that's why the reference in the talk to the sort of role of the British Irish, I think, is an interesting one, and one that we perhaps need to consider. Northern Ireland electors as a whole voted to remain within the EU. There was something of a communalised split. Probably most nationalists did vote to remain. Probably a majority of unionists voted to leave. Indeed, the people before profit, the socialist workers movement, they had two MLAs, two members of the Assembly, Jerry Carroll and Eamon McCann. Comrades will be familiar with Eamon McCann. Well, Eamon lost his seat in Derry because of his support for Brexit. The Shinners, rather mischievously, but accurately, you couldn't say they were lying, but they said, who votes for Brexit? And it was the DUP, the UUP, and people before profit. And, you know, Eamon McCann, who, I mean, we're all, none of us are getting any younger, and was possibly past his best, but he was still a, put it like that, he was still a better representative of working people in the Assembly than virtually everybody else other than Jerry Carroll. You know, lost his seat in that way. So that, I think, shows something of the divisions that Brexit caused. But the main divisions were within unionism, and in particular, the response, particularly the way that Johnson led the unionists along, and the way they identified the unionist parties identified their interest with the Conservatives. And that, of course, was I think largely behind the crisis with Arlene Foster and then Poots, but it still, I think, poses deep uncertainties, an uncertain role about the position of the unionist population and its relationship both inside the north of Ireland and Britain. Unionist power that I referred to, economic and social and political power, is waning. And I think we can partly see that by the very overhyped loyalist mobilizations that were supposed to have taken place earlier this year. The media were really bigging up the threat of going back to violence, the threat of the marching season. Well, comrades, the Apprentice Boys had their march on Saturday. 500 people, 8 bands marched around the walls of Derry, and you know, it was a relatively damp squib. In other words, that mobilization hasn't occurred, and I think this shows in many senses that unionism is in retreat. Now, of course, it still is a powerful, you know, section of the population, even if, for example, it does nominally become a minority. It still is a significant force, and how the border poll, and indeed how the demands for Irish unification address that, I think is important, and in many ways that's, you know, the key area for our discussion, which I'll come back into questions, but I'm going to conclude shortly. The revolutionary force that could have reunited Ireland, the revolutionary struggle that could have done that, completing the national democratic revolution, that force was defeated and is, you know, has been drawn into the British state in Ireland. So if we're talking about reunification, if we're talking about the nature of that reunification, then we have to look, as Moshe was talking this morning, we have to look for the agency that's going to carry that out. And one agent is definitely not going to be a border poll in which Sinn Féin, who are now a clearly sort of communalised sectarian Catholic party, are in the leading vanguard. That will simply be a consolidation, I think, of sectarianism. And the type of reunited Ireland that will emerge will in many ways just be a reconfiguration of the Good Friday Agreement. What's not on offer is a 32-county republic. What is probably going to be on offer is yet again more jiggery-pokery, more power sharing, more fudges in that way. So I think Anne is quite correct to reject that. And I think our discussion should be on the nature of our demands, the point about the Constituent Assembly, but also about the sort of forces that can actually take up that fight, because it is going to be very much a case that it's not going to be the Dublin government, it's not going to be the British state, and it certainly won't be the sectarian Catholics of Sinn Féin that are going to do it. Anyway, comrades, I'll conclude there and we can discuss the points now.